This is chapter 6 from the third. Well, actually, we're calling it chapter 6 because it's in the next edition, the 14th edition. It is chapter 6, but this is chapter 6 from Understanding Human Communication, and chapter 6 talks about listening. The first thing we talk about here is the value of listening. They have done studies that show people with good listening skills are more likely than others to be hired and promoted. Listening is a primary leadership skill in every study done, basically. A very important thing to know is that good listeners are not easily fooled. We unfortunately don't apply all our listening skills, and sometimes we allow ourselves to be fooled or deceived, which is unfortunate. Uh, Asking for and listening to advice in terms of listening makes you look good. It makes people think highly of you because they know you're wanting to do a good job, a better job, and to in your life and improve your life. Listening makes you a better friend and a better romantic partner. The book talks about that. It's it is something that it's sort of a stereotype we have of men, about women complaining about men not listening to them, but it does work in both directions at times. There are times where some women sometimes don't listen to the men that are in their lives, and sometimes a lot of times it does happen where it is not happening in the other direction as well. So misconceptions about listening and hearing are the same thing. That is a misconception. Listening and hearing are not the same thing. They are not the same thing. Hearing is just the process of the sound going into your earlobes, through into your ears, moving the follicles around, tell you that there was a noise. Now, you may ignore it. You may get used to it. I live near a highway. Cars will go down the highway. I pay attention to it. Don't listen to it. I lived on a very, very busy street once in Pasadena, California. Cars nonstop. I got to the point where I just tuned them out. I heard it, but did not listen to it. Very big difference. Listening involves attending, understanding. Uh, there's the thing and understanding. There's a thing called listening fidelity. It's the degree to which what the listener understands, and what the messenger wanted the listener to understand are the same. And you can have a great deal of listening fidelity, but you can also have gaps there at times. We do responding, and we also do remembering, and then there, as at some point in time, the residual message. Uh, Another myth number 2: listening is a natural process. Listening is not a natural process. Listening is a hard process. It is actually hard work. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Being mindful listening is being fully present with others, paying close attention to their gestures, manners, and the things that they say and don't say. Another myth: all listeners receive the same message. All listeners do not receive the same message. And that's because of some of the reasons for poor listening, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Challenges to effective listening, some reasons for poor listening. One is just message overload. If you're in class today and you listen to your teacher, and then you go to another class, and you go to another class, 3 or 4 classes, you may have been listening for 4 hours plus. Then you get into your car and you turn on the radio or a CD or something like that, and then you drive down the road, and there are traffic signals and there are billboards and all kinds of things, and you get home. Then you turn on the TV and you watch some TV, and then all of a sudden your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife wants to talk, and you're already in message overload. That can be problematic. Rapid thought: we actually are capable of hearing sounds and understanding speech at rates of up to 600 words per minute. However, the average speaker speaks 100 to 140 words per minute. Now, the problem with that is this: I say something to you right now and you hear that, and then I pause for a second. Your brain just went 13 other places. You may not be with me anymore. That's problematic. So rapid thought does affect how much we listen. It's one of the reasons for poor listening. We talked earlier on an earlier chapter about the different kinds of noise. There's the phys- physiological noise, psychological noise, and physiological noise, and the actual noise, physical noise happening around you. Earlier today it was raining. I thought, well, I'm not going to record this while it's raining. That could be problematic. Uh, Physiological noise, though, things happening in your body. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep last night. Maybe you haven't had lunch yet. Psychological noise. I give the example of someone talking to you that you're mad at, and you're angry with them. They're trying to talk to you. You've got a great deal of psychological noise because you're upset with them about something. Another is a hearing problem. I once went and had my hearing checked at Tuscaloosa Ear, Nose, and Throat, and I would recommend them, by the way. And I asked them when I went there, because my hearing was fine. My wife had asked me to get my hearing checked, just to be blunt. I said, let me ask you a question. So about what percentage of your business is because a wife asked her husband his hearing check? They said probably close to 90%. Wow. What percentage of those guys have hearing problems? They said probably about 5%. Well, anyway, there are also cultural differences in how we listen and why we listen. And one of the biggest things is just the media influences. We're watching television. And of course, this has changed a great deal because of streaming without commercials, and also fast forwarding on DVRs and things along that line. But in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, before we sort of reached that point where there was this, the VCRs were becoming prevalent, people could fast forward. But there was a time where the commercials came initially every 15 minutes. Then they sped up and they started coming every 10 minutes. And then they started coming every, I think it's 6 minutes, and some are even 5. I started to watch something on Pluto TV earlier today at lunchtime, and after 4 minutes there were 6 commercials. After 4 more minutes, they started commercials again. I just stopped watching it. So, but the media influences, that gap, those quick commercials, has affected the attention span of young people, and teachers have even had to adjust for that. Faulty listening habits that we have: we pretend to listen, but we don't listen. We pretend to listen, but we're not listening. Maybe our wife's talking to us, and we're channel flipping. Yeah, we're pretending to listen, but we're not listening. I had a young man named Michael in college in an interpersonal class who was married. And and he was an Asian American, very, very polite. And I say this not asking anybody to call me Mr. Pritchett, but Michael came up to me after I talked about pseudo listening. He said, "Oh, Mr. Pritchett, I got to tell you something." I said, "Well, what is it, Michael?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you know that thing you said about channel flipping?" He said, "That's what I do to my wife." I said, "Well, Michael, when you go home this week, when your wife wants to talk to you, try this. Turn the TV off, put the remote down, turn to her and say, 'What would you like to talk about?'" Michael came back the next week and he said, "Oh, Mr. Pritchett, I've got to tell you something." Well, what is it, Michael? He said, "I did what you said. Oh, I said, I want to talk to you. I turned the TV off. I put the remote down. I turned to her and said, 'What would you like to talk about?'" He said her jaw dropped. And she said, "Michael, I don't know what to say." That's how surprised she was. But that's one of the things that we do. We're also selective listeners. We hear what we want to hear. We're also insulated listeners. And I really wish these two were next to each other because they're related. We don't hear what we don't want to hear. That's problematic. We defend ourselves. Sometimes we're defensive listening. We're just listening for things that people say that might bother us and then gathering up ammo with which to attack them. We sometimes miss the underlying point. We're insensitive listeners. There's something someone says and we're not listening. We're not really tuned in. Or maybe they say it and there's a nonverbal aspect of it we don't really catch on to that means that they don't mean what they're saying. It's problematic. Anyway, we tend to be self-centered, honestly. There are people who are just, they're everything's about them. Everything's about them. They're stage hogs. We assume that talking is more impressive than listening, and it's not. It really is not. There are a lot of times people may be thought of as wise or other things like that, and really they're just kind of quiet. And so they don't talk as much to other people, and people tend to look at them and say, "Wow, that person has they hold back and they think. Clearly that person must have a little more wisdom." Well, actually, not speaking sometimes does show wisdom. Sometimes we speak when we shouldn't be speaking. Some types of listening. One is task-oriented listening, listening to get the job done. We go to doing your job, we're getting trained, we're getting on-the-job training, and we listen so that we can understand and get a job done. Men tend to be, and again, this is a stereotype, I know, but men tend to be a little bit more task-oriented listeners. We'll come back to that concept in a minute. If you're going to do that, though, you need to look for key ideas. You do need to ask questions and make sure they're good questions. Try to avoid, by the way, and this is one of those things where it boggles my mind when I was watching the Senate hearing a while back, how many questions they asked when they were doing the trial after the impeachment. Uh, don't do counterfeit questions. Don't do questions that make statements. A lot of their questions made statements. Don't do questions that carry hidden agendas. Most of their questions had hidden agendas. Don't do questions that seek correct answers. Most of their questions sought correct answers. And don't do questions that are based on unchecked assumptions. Why are you mad at me? I didn't know I was mad at you. That's a question based on an unchecked assumption. Going forward now, we'll talk a little bit about relational listening. It just takes time to build a relationship, to listen. You have to listen for You have to take the time to listen. You have to listen for unexpressed thoughts and feelings. Try to encourage further comments at times. Try to make sure the other person knows that you care enough about them that you're listening, and you'll listen however long you may need. And be careful about that, because if you know that you're going to run out of time on this, it can hurt a relationship instead of helping it. Analytical listening, trying to listen to understand the message. Hopefully that's what you're doing in class. We listen to the information before we evaluate it. We try to separate the message from the speaker. We search for the value of how it's going to help us. All along through every lecture, not every lecture, but a lot of the lectures I've talked to you about the value of public speaking, how it's going to affect your life in the future. I would say the same thing to you about mass communication. Take a mass communication class. It's an important thing. And of course, this class does include interpersonal communication, but I believe that, I honestly believe that if the accreditation committees were going to be honest and try to look at the future for our students that are coming up, they would require public speaking, they would require interpersonal communication, and they would require a class, Introduction to Mass Communication, help students understand what it is mass communication is trying to do and doing. Critical listening, we're examining the speaker's evidence and reasoning. We're evaluating the speaker's credibility. We're examining emotional appeals. We're trying to assess, is this message valid? You might imagine if you were on a jury in court, you would be doing critical listening. But it's not the only place you should do critical listening. You should do critical listening in class, and you should do critical listening in church. So that's a very important thing, because if you're not doing critical listening in those places, there could be problematic. It could be problematic. Listening and social support. There's online social support. It's very important. It's something where people get together online. Of course, I think that it should be more social support and less of the political dialogue and wrangling that it has become. It's unfortunate. I had a Facebook page. I closed it down and started a new one. And I'm just going to tell people, listen, if you're here to debate politics, we can still be friends, but we don't have to be friends here on Facebook, because I'm really here to stay in touch with my friends and my family and fellow church members and things along that line. But I'm not here to argue politics. I'm not here to see people yell and scream about things that, just sometimes just aren't that important, unfortunately. Gender and social support. There are some stereotypes here that the book talks about. Men have traditionally been socialized to focus less on emotional connections, more on competition, and men are often discouraged if they're expressing intense emotions. And sometimes when men and women are having a dialogue and a woman is telling a man her problems, she's looking for emotional support, and as he's listening, he figures out an answer. So he does that task-oriented listening that I mentioned earlier, and said, "Well, here's what you need to do." Gentlemen, young men out there who are listening, unless your girlfriend or your friend that's talking to you and telling you their problems, could be your sister, could be someone along that line, unless they stop and ask you, "What do you think I should do?" Don't jump in. Don't fill in the blank. Don't jump to there without being asked to go to there. And be careful even if you're asked to go to there. Types of supporting responses that you might do. One is advising. Be very careful about advising. Don't give advice about something that you're not qualified to give advice about. It's real simple. Don't give advice about things that you're not qualified to give advice about. You might be asked to do judging when you're supporting or analyzing. If you're doing that, you don't want to ask questions to satisfy your own curiosity. You don't want to ask confusing questions. You don't want to use questions to disguise your suggestions or criticisms. Well, that was a stupid thing to do, wasn't it? That's not a question. That's a criticism. Comforting. It's good to try to comfort people. Make sure your comforting is sincere. Make sure the other person can accept your support, and comfort in a realistic way. If you're going to say, "I understand a little bit about how you feel," okay. But don't say to someone, "I know just how you feel," because you don't. You just don't. Sorry, you don't. I had someone tell me that after I had a son who passed away in 1987. Someone told me, "Oh, I know just how you feel." I said, "Really? You had a son die?" No. I said, "Well, okay then. Guess you don't know how I feel." And I would never say that to someone who had a child pass away, even though I had a son pass away. I might tell you to someone, "I have some small sense of how you may feel because of the fact that I had a child pass away." Be careful on that as well. When and how to help. You have to think about the situation. You have to think about the other person, and you have to think about your own strengths and weaknesses. Your own strengths and weaknesses. You cannot start listening to someone telling you a heavy problem and then suddenly cut them out. You know what? Thought I had time, but I really don't. Or I thought I cared more about it. I really don't. Neither one of those. You can't do either one of those if someone is in a very heavy situation that they get into and start telling you a serious problem. That is chapter 6. We'll get this up. Going to